So yesterday we finished talking about India, and that's what the bell ringer was about. And of course, after we're done with the notes, just like before, you can have some time to work on anything from Unit 4, and including if you want to work ahead and work on the slideshow for the units that helps you review for the test, you can do that as well. But today we'll take the rest of the notes which are on Africa. We talked about China and India because they're big powers economically. And we'll talk about the continent of Africa because it's rich with resources, so it has a lot of potential. So the first thing we'll do is we'll just say some things in general about Africa. First off, there were many ancient kingdoms that existed on the continent. So at the same time, you think of Rome and Athens and all that kind of stuff. There was also kingdoms that existed on the African continent as well. And they traded in things like gold, ivory, and exotic animals. But that would typically only be ones that, of course, had access to waterfront, like river or sea or anything like that. And, of course, one of the oldest civilizations in the world is Egypt. So Egypt is one of the oldest civilizations in the world. In fact, the first recorded government was in Egypt itself. So Egypt is one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And contact was extremely limited, even during the colonial era, when there were large amounts of slaves purchased from Africa. It was mostly just along the coast. So during the colonial era, there were slaves purchased from the West African coast. And Arabs also took slaves from the east. And the Europeans in particular really didn't do it themselves. They went to these kingdoms and then purchased slaves from the kingdom. So it was unusual for Europeans themselves to go capture slaves. So colonial era, there was the purchasing of slaves from the West African coast, while Arabs took slaves from the east. And we already mentioned before that during the imperial era, Europe carved up Africa. During the imperial era, Europe carved up Africa. So once again, we already said this before, so you don't need to write this part down, but a lot of the boundaries that we see on the African continent were created by Europeans. So during the World Wars, Africa supplied natural resources and troops. Natural resources and troops. And a lot of people don't realize that there was actually a lot of battles that happened in North Africa. So Africa supplied resources and troops. Many achieved independence starting with the 40s and 50s. Many achieved independence in the 40s or 50s. And if you were to ask how, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some of them through peaceful means, some of them through violent means. So independence in the 40s and 50s. And it's important to note that there were few improvements left over. Few improvements left over. So despite the size of Africa, there was very few roads, very few railroads, very few telephone lines, hardly any colleges established by the Europeans. So very few improvements were left over. Few improvements. Many countries have roots in democracy. Many of them do have roots in democracy, especially the ones that were taken over briefly by Europe. So many countries do have roots in democracy. But some, at this point, probably not a majority, but some struggle with military rule, corruption, and dictatorships. Dictatorships. Now that last one is debatable because some of them do have elections, but the same guy gets elected like 10 times for 4-year terms each. So they're in office for 40 years and they get like 98% of the vote. So some people doubt sometimes the validity of the elections. Today, there's oil in the north. Oil in the north. And rare minerals in the central part. Rare minerals in the central part. So a lot of people don't realize the stuff that we need for cell phones and laptops, and that a lot of it comes from Central Africa. So those are just some general things. And of course, a concern is that China has started to invest heavily in Africa. You say, well, who cares? They can do whatever they want, but obviously that expands their economic power and influence throughout the world. But let's talk about Kenya. It's one of the 4 countries in this unit. And you can see Kenya, close-up view of it there. And you can also see where it is exactly in Africa. Just one of the over 50 countries. By 1920, it was a British colony with farming and railroads. Farming and railroads. Farming and railroads. But like the general trends I pointed out here, after World War II in 1952, they had what was called the Mau Rebellion. And Mao was spelled M-A-U, twice. M-A-U. The Mau Rebellion. And one of their leaders was the guy up there in the center of the screen. His name is Kenyatta, which is spelled Kenya, Kenya, T-T-A. That's Kenya, T-T-A. So he was one of the leaders, and he was thrown in jail. But of course, the British realized they couldn't keep this up forever, so by 1963, he was freed. Kenya was given independence. and he was elected president. So he went from rebel to prisoner to president within a decade. By the 1990s, the economy slowed. And there was ethnic fighting. The economy slowed and there was ethnic fighting. That's something important that a lot of people in the United States and Europe forget about, is that there's Africa's one continent with 50 countries and probably hundreds of different cultural groups. By the 2000s, there was more party competition. For a long time, the only political party they had was the one that Kenyatta had started. So by the 2000s, there started to be some competition. Unfortunately, despite this improvement, they have also had problems with Islamic terrorism. Islamic terrorism. So they have had problems with Islamic terrorism. But there's still hope because of the party competition. They can have more candidates with different ideas running for office. Obviously, the fact that they can still farm hasn't changed, so they do have the ability to produce crops, and they're part of the British Commonwealth, so they're part of the British system, which also helps with trade. So hopefully things will improve for Kenya and the terrorism subsides so that way they don't become a place of interest for the United States later on. So that's Kenya in a nutshell. The next country I'd like to look at is Libya. And once again, there's a picture of Libya on the left, what it looks like close up, and on the right is where it actually is in the north. Libya was under the control of the Ottoman Turks. It was under control of the Ottoman Turks from 1551 to 1912. Ottoman Turks, 1551 to 1912. So a long, long time. And then they were taken over by Italy. Now, if you remember me saying some of the battles happened in North Africa, well, this would be one of the places, unfortunately. Because remember, Italy was with Germany during World War II, so some of the fighting did happen here. In 1949, the people there attempted to set up the Kingdom of Libya. In 1949, the Kingdom of Libya. But that didn't last long. And soon, this guy in the center here would take over. His name is Gaddafi, which is spelled Gaddafi. That's Gaddafi. He was a military officer, and he used his influence within the army to take over Libya. Gaddafi. But he wasn't the most amazing person. He cracked down on critics, purged opposition, jailing or executing people. And he had some ties to terrorism. Those are some bad things, but there were some good things. One of them is that he did manage to harvest oil. So that brought Libya a lot of wealth, the fact that they had oil. Literacy improved. Not that many people could read when he first took over, but that changed drastically. Literacy improved. And compared to some other countries in the area, women had a great amount of freedom. But those bad things kind of outweighed the good. And in 2011, there was an uprising. And he was tortured to death. Beaten, stabbed, dragged through the streets. It was not a pleasant way to go. It was replaced by a weaker government. So they did have elections and democracy, but unfortunately it's kind of weak. Nobody takes charge like a dictator. So, a little bit weaker government. And that's where the United States, of course, comes in, because in 2012, there was a terrorist attack against an American consulate. There was a terrorist attack against an American consulate. Consulate is spelled Consulate. Consulate. Does anybody know what city it was in? It was in the news a lot. Anybody know? Starts with a B. The city's name is Benghazi. Benghazi is spelled Benghzi. Benghzi. It resulted in the deaths of 4 people. And it was mostly because the United States had bad information about the area and also not really good resources put into it as well. So bad information and lack of resources. And then there's Egypt. Egypt's kind of an odd country because we could say it's Africa, but it's also part of the Middle East. Like I said, it had an ancient history, so you might wonder when did the Western society start to get involved? Well, that goes the whole way back to Rome. They were basically controlled by Rome in ancient times. And lots of countries throughout history have been interested in trying to control it. Why? Because of this area right here that basically makes it a crossroads between Africa and Asia, and then it's not too far away from Europe either. So lots of countries have tried to control it. And the one European country that did manage to take control for the most part was Britain in 1882. And they were interested, of course, in putting something there that has been a key resource ever since then. Does anybody know what we call a structure that connects two bodies of water? Yeah. Canal, yes. The Suez Canal. One of the two big ones. The other one's the Panama Canal here in the Western Hemisphere. But the Suez Canal, S-U-E-Z, allows ships to sail back and forth between those two bodies of water. So that's why the British really wanted to be there. But by 1952, this is going to sound familiar, the military took over. The military took over in 1952. And their leader, Nasser, which is spelled Nasser, he tried to play favorites with both the Soviet Union and the United States. So to get whatever he could, he would pretend to be friends with the Soviets, and maybe the next week he would pretend to be friends with the United States. But of course, they've had their issues. They lost the 6-Day War with Israel. They They're both once again fighting over this territory that I highlighted up on the map. They lost the 6-Day War with Israel. But later made peace. So they were one of the first countries to make peace with Israel. Now, about the same time there was an uprising in Libya, there was an uprising in Egypt in 2011 as well. And so they did hold elections. So there was an uprising in 2011, and so they did end up holding elections. However, we like to think as Americans or as Europeans, wouldn't it be nice if everybody just had elections and had nice, clean, smooth running governments? And the problem is you never know who's going to get elected. And the guy that got elected was a very radical Muslim. And so even though he had been jailed by the military, when he became president, he started throwing a lot of other people in jail. So that didn't last long. So very shortly after this happened, the military took back over, threw that guy in jail, and he mysteriously died shortly after. So be careful what you wish for if you ask for elections. You might end up getting someone worse. So the military is back in control in Egypt today. And the last country I'd like to mention is South Africa. South Africa. Once again, you can see a large picture of it on the left. And then on the right, its location. Quite the opposite of Libya, way to the south, literally fulfilling its name. Now, if you look at that dot right there, that's not a mistake. It's one of the few countries that is totally surrounded by another country. That's incredibly unusual. But originally it was both a Dutch and British colony. Dutch and British colony. So you can see the British have this nice little chain of colonies that runs up from north to south, going from South Africa to Kenya to Egypt. Dutch and British. The locals attempted to resist in what's called the Zulu Wars. Locals attempted to resist in what is called the Zulu Wars. Z-U-L-U. Z-U-L-U. And they actually did end up massacring a whole unit of the British Army, but the British Army came back with machine guns, and that kind of ended the war. So they did attempt to resist. But that wasn't the only conflict that happened, because both the Dutch and the British wanted to control South Africa, and so they fought each other in what was called the Boer War, which is spelled B-O-E-R. So the Dutch and British both fought each other, the Boer War. So they came to an agreement. They would side with the British, but they would get their own country. They would side with the British, but they would get their own country. But it wasn't exactly a nice country, because between 1948 and 1994, there was apartheid, which is spelled A-P-A-R-T-H-E-I-D. That's A-P-A-R-T-H-E-I-D. What this was is kind of like segregation in the South here, except a lot more vicious. Blacks actually made up an overwhelming majority of the population, but even though they outnumbered whites like 10-1 in some cases, they were not allowed to vote, not allowed to run for office. If they were unemployed or if they weren't carrying around their ID, they could be thrown in jail. And so it was one of the most racist and restrictive governments that ever existed. They attempted to rebel. And one of their leaders, who's pictured there in the bottom center, was thrown in jail. His name is Mandela, which is spelled M-A-N-D-E-L-A. M-A-N-D-E-L-A. And a lot of people were thrown in jail. Thousands of people, many who ended up dying in prison. There's like lists of hundreds of people where the cause of death is falling downstairs or stuff like that. So it was an incredibly brutal regime. But luckily, the United Nations ended up having sanctions or stopping trade with South Africa. So the United Nations wanted to stop trade with them, so that way they would be pressured to change. And that's luckily what happened, although it took a long time. In 1994, the government gave up. They freed the prisoners. And similar to Kenya, Mandela here got elected president of South Africa. Although he's an inspiring person because he became lifelong friends with the prison guards. He actually advocated for giving whites, even the ones that advocated for the racist policies, because he believed South Africa could only do well if it was United. So that's all for the notes. And you can submit those whenever you're ready. Make sure you have comments in the margin and a summary at the bottom. And the other thing that goes along with this unit, of course, would be the last journal, which just asks, why do you think the instructor included certain African nations in this part of the unit? So that is journal number 3. So make sure you submit both of those things. And then, of course, next week we will look at the review. There's a study guide, the slideshow, which some of you have already started, and then the test on Thursday.